So we worship him in song, we worship him by fellowshipping, we worship him in giving, we worship him by being attentive to his word. So turn to Matthew chapter 13. We're going to be in the very first gospel in the New Testament, chapter 13. And in just a minute, we're going to read some verses from that. Let me just start with this. You know, there is nothing like a good story, right? Nothing like a good story. I know the Mejias, Ariel and Josue, love reading to the girls. The girls love reading. When they come to our house, we do a ton of reading. They'll go grab a boatload of books off the bookshelf, and they love stories. We love sharing stories. I got to hang out with them Friday morning for a little bit and had some time with them just on my lap, not even with books, and I just told them some stories. And I forgot first service, and I forgot again. Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and Caps for Sale, which is one of my favorite from when I was a kid. Some Bible stories. We did David and Goliath, and they love the story of the birth of Jesus and Mary and all that. So, I mean, just everybody loves a story. And probably you know this, but do you know that one of the main ways Jesus communicated was with stories? So in Matthew, I'd like us to look at the first 2.5 verses 1 and 2, and part of verse 3, because he taught with stories, specifically parables. And here's what it says in Matthew 13. It says, that same day Jesus went out of the house and he sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and he sat in it, and while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables. So stop there. And keep your finger. We're going to come back to Matthew towards the end because I want to look at another text related to this. But he told many things in parables. And so here's what I think. If they're so important to him, they were so significant for him that he gave that time and attention to that, I think they deserve our study and our attention. And so we're going to start a series this fall, and we're going to be looking at a number of the parables together. If you are a note taker, because I have to set up the parables, and that's part of what I'm going to do this morning. And so there's going to be kind of a lot of stuff. I want you to know if you're a note taker, you can still take some, but I'm going to have a sheet next week that's going to have a lot of this information on it because I think it's important in how we approach parables, which I will show you in a minute. But let me define what a parable is. A parable is it's a simple, short story, simple plot, usually focus on one main event. They're concrete and they're extremely vivid. What I love about them is they're thoroughly rooted in real life. They take events and objects out of everyday life for us, things that we can easily identify with. The parables talk about things like farmers and farming, banking and investing, cooking, feasts, banquets, parties, hiring workers. And these stories, they have these very powerful archetypal contrasts or archetypes in them, these very contrasting motifs, things like lost and found, good and bad, wise and unwise, who's in and who's out. So I'm curious how you would answer this question. Why do you think Jesus would use stories? What would you say? Why would Jesus use stories? Do what? Relatable. Highly relatable. They're interesting. Entertaining. Do what? Yeah, they promote understanding. Memorable. You guys could preach for me. Great job. I made a list. Everybody loves stories, right? God designed us as storying people. We live stories. We act out. We tell stories. Our lives are stories. They're interesting. They're easy to pay attention to. Stories are universal, right? Every storytelling happens in every culture, and a good story has universal themes that speaks into anybody's life, no matter the culture. Some of this I'm saying what was said, simple to understand. Like a lecture may not be easy to understand, a sermon may not be easy to understand, but stories are effective with everybody, old and young, educated, uneducated. And as somebody said, they're easy to remember, right? Again, you're probably not going to remember most sermons you've heard, but if you hear a really good story, you'll remember that story. They're simple. Here's what's cool, but they can also be really deep. They can have a layer underneath that they're communing something else, a layer of meaning that's not on the surface, and so they lend themselves to reflection and application. I also love this about stories. They're non-threatening. People will put up barriers to something you're telling them, especially if it's something they don't want to hear, but they will listen to a story, right? Because stories are safe and people are more receptive to a story. You tell a story, people will sit and listen. And I think because of the reasons, the things you guys shared, those things, that's why they're such effective teachers, and good teachers use them, especially if you're teaching spiritual truth, because they capture people's attention, they arouse curiosity, they draw you in, and people will listen, and when the point is made, it will stick with people. And that's why teaching with stories, it's universal. People in all cultures, great teachers use stories. Aesop's a great example, right, with his fables. And it's just not over the whole world. They were very common in Jesus' day. The religious leaders in his day, the rabbis, frequently used parables to teach. So let me tell you a little bit more, some specifics about Jesus' parables as we're going to enter into them, because we need to understand some things, okay? So some more specific things. First, though they are simple, his parables are quite profound because they're symbolic stories. They're kind of like a metaphor or a simile. They use the familiar and the known to help us understand the unfamiliar and the unknown. In fact, our word parable comes from the Greek word parabole. So that word is just a transliteration in English. Would you say the word parabole with me? Parabole. Very good. In Greek, it means para means beside or next to. Bale means to cast or to set. And so it means to place alongside. So in a parable, Jesus is laying down a story that we are intended to take key principles and key insights from that, and we're to transfer them over into understanding who is God and how does he work and what is he like, what does he value, okay? Does that make sense? So you're laying a story down next to God. So a parable is a story that really sits alongside a deeper spiritual reality to give us insight into that spiritual reality. So as such, while some or a good number of the parables are pretty straightforward and easy to understand, a lot of them are very mysterious. They're kind of a puzzle. There's like a riddle almost to them. Some are even downright baffling, like the parable of the unjust steward or the unjust servant in Luke 16. That's a parable people constantly are like, I do not understand the point of that story. I preached on it. That's why I preached on it like 3 years ago, because I wanted us to there's a really important idea and truth in it. They're also, they're mysterious because they're multi-layered. Again, I said they're symbolic, right? They have more than one level of meaning. There's that surface level of the actual story, and then down underneath is this deeper level of the spiritual meaning that Jesus is trying to communicate. And here's what that reality means. That reality means that parables take work. They take work, okay? That deeper meaning, the spiritual correspondence, it's not always obvious. You have to work to get that deeper meaning. They're intentionally designed to get people to ponder them, to think about them, and to try to figure out what's going on. You have to do work to dig, to mine the treasures out of a parable. They're not just laying on the surface, okay? A few more things. With parables, expect the unexpected. They're full of twists and turns. They're full of reversals. Frequently, you get to the ending, and it will catch you off guard because the ending it flips from what you would expect, make a different point than you thought. So for his original hearers, there was definitely a shock value in hearing the parables. And so when you're studying a parable, expect to be surprised and expect to have your assumptions challenged. They were intended by Jesus to be provocative and to challenge conventional thinking. That's why the song fits so well with the parables, because we all have our religion and our tradition that we think is truth, and his parables are intended to challenge those things. So you cannot be neutral with one of his parables. They are very polarizing. Frequently, they'll have a contrast between two people, one person living this way, viewing life, viewing God this way, somebody living and viewing God another way. And the fact of these contrasts, he intentionally meant them that way because they are forced to make people to make a choice. And that's what he wants. And really, that's really key, because the ultimate purpose in the parables is to elicit a response from his hearers. They're not just for information. He intended them to bring people to a point of decision. And you're going to find that every week. They'll bring you to a point of decision. So the question is, how do you interpret these things? And yeah, just let me say why I'm doing this. Because I really believe God calls me not just to teach his word, but I think God calls me to train his people on how to approach and understand his word. So I'm going to talk about this because I think it's important that I'm not the only one that understands this. I think we all need to know how to approach a parable. So how do we interpret it? To me, it's essential to explore because the parables have a very long history of misinterpretation. Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart say, for all of their charm and simplicity, the parables have suffered a fate of misinterpretation in the church, second only to the book of Revelation. And I mean, we've heard all sorts of crazy stories about what Revelation means, 1,000 different things, right? And they say parables are like second to that in misunderstanding. And here's the reason why. Because people treat parables like an allegory. They treat them like an allegory. They want to take every single detail in a parable and they want to make it mean something. St. Augustine did this with the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think it's one that we all know. It's a pretty famous one. Simple story. I think it has a pretty simple point. But I want you to see, I'm going to show you, Augustine made everything in that story mean something, have a deeper meaning. So in the story, the man who was robbed on his way of Jericho, he said represented Adam. He said the city of Jericho actually represented the moon, and the moon is symbolic of our mortality. And I want you to know, I've lived my whole life at this point, I've never thought of the moon. One is Jericho is the moon, or two, that the moon represents my mortality. To me, it's a really cool thing to look at night. Like, it's kind of big these days, right? The thieves represent the devil and the angels, the priest and Levite, the Old Testament. The inn, the Samaritan took the injured man to, represents the church, in his view. The innkeeper represented the apostles. And I love this one. The Samaritan's down payment that he made to the innkeeper, it represents God's call to all of us for celibacy, which is exciting, right? I've read that parable hundreds of times, and I never got the call to celibacy out of it, ever. But he found it. And I say that with all due respect. There's so much good that comes out of him. But to be honest, the first time I read his ideas, I just thought, I mean, is he for real? But a lot of people do this with the parables. And that's not what we're to do with the parables. So here's the first thing I would say is do not treat the parables as allegories. This is so important. I want you to say it with me, okay? Do not treat the parables as allegories, okay? Because in an allegory, each character, each object in the story contains some deep symbolic meaning. John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. Have many of you read that? It's one of the most read books in the world. And as a new believer, I was given to it and told to read it, and I learned a lot of good stuff in it. That is a true allegory, but I want you to know Jesus' parables are not. Some of the details have special meaning, but most do not. So don't read too much into them. So I want to tell you how to approach the parables correctly. And the first question that we should ask is this: which of the symbols should I pay attention to and think about in this parable? And here's how you go about that. So first, identify the main characters and who they may represent, okay? Who or what they may represent. The main characters, more often not in parables, are people, but sometimes they're objects. You'll find sheep as a main character, a coin, you'll find treasure. More often than not, there are 3 or 2 characters in most parables, 3 or 2 main characters. A few of them have a few more. So, for example, the story of a woman and her yeast and her dough, or a banker and 2 debtors, or the story of a father and a younger son and an older son, or you'll see a story of a man and a treasure, or a shepherd and lost sheep, or a woman and lost coin. There she is. And so it's these main characters in the parable. They're the ones that embody some important spiritual reality. So the question is, like, how do I know what the main characters are? How do I know what to zero in on? And I would say this: the main characters are those people or objects that are just essential to the plot of the story, that if you pull them out, the story will collapse, it will fall in on itself. So, for example, in the parable of the lost coin in Luke 15:8, it says this: suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? The most important characters in this story, I've already shared it, but it is a woman, and it is one coin that is lost. The other details, the number 10, the lamp, the sweeping. They're just kind of window dressing to the story, okay? They're not essential to the plot. So once we've identified those key characters, then what we ask is like, who do they represent? Who does the woman represent? Who does the lost coin represent? I'm going to do this story in a few weeks, but the woman represents, I'll let you in on it now. Would you have a guess, by the way? Anybody want to take a guess? Jesus or God. They're the same, so we'll take it, right? Yeah, she represents God. Frequently, in most of the parables, one of the characters is God. Not always, but many times. And so we kind of figure some of that out. And next, we want to determine what is the main theme. What is the main theme? So once you've identified the main characters, we look at their role. Here's how you do that. You look at their role in the overall plot. And we do this by asking, what's going on between these characters? If I redid the diagram, what I would do is I would have a triangle like with the father, younger son, elder son, and in the middle I would put the main point, the theme, because the theme comes with the interaction between the main characters. So the parable of the lost coin, the question is who does the woman represent? Who does the coin represent? Which, I'm sorry, I've already kind of hit all that stuff. So back to the main theme. So with the characters in mind, and especially the plot, here's what we ask. What is the main point? What that he's trying to make? What is he driving at? What's the big idea? There can be some sub-meanings to them, but the truth is that in the end, the story is about one thing. So in the parable of the lost coin, the woman loses the coin. Is this the one that has those in blue? She loses the coin. She searches for the coin. She finds the coin. That's where the plot of the story is going. So in the parable of the lost coin, then, it's really all about God's search for the lost. That's what it's about. That's the point. So those two things are the most important things in trying to understand a parable. They're the biggies. But I want to share a few other things that are important. So as in all biblical interpretation, context and culture are really important. So first, context. Because in Bible interpretation, context is king. So pay attention to the text. Ask the question. So when I look at a parable, I'm like, is there some story around that's the context of it? So I'll look at the verses before it and see if there's something that's going on that tells me why Jesus is telling that story. So I'm asking, who is the original audience? What was the setting? In the story of the lost coin, we learn which is in Luke 15:8, we learn the beginning of Luke that the religious leaders are angry at him because he's hanging out with sinful people and they want to know why. And so this parable is his answer to their question. So the context really matters. There's not always going to be a clear context around it. As we get into the parables of Matthew 13, there's no context that helps with that, but a lot of them have that. So look for that context. And then culture is really important because much of, I think, the difficulty in understanding the parables comes from the culture gap. And the culture that we're dealing with is first century Israel. That's the culture we're dealing with. And it's essential we honor that culture. I've said this many times before, but remember, when we read the Bible, we read the New Testament with first century lenses. Okay, I'm not reading with 21st century lenses. I'm reading with first century lenses, and then afterwards I'm asking 21st century questions. So I just want you to know there are details that happen in the parables that very much are tied to culture, and if you want to get the meaning of those things, it's important to know that, because there's some things they knew in their culture that we don't know. So you want to know that culture behind the parable. Do your cultural research. Ask, is there detail here that there's something cultural behind it? And I know you're like, how in the world do I do that? And I want to tell you, this book, it is a must book. It's one of the books I use more than anything. It gives you the culture behind what's going on in the Bible. This IVP Bible background commentary of the New Testament. So I highly recommend you get that. It goes through the whole New Testament, and if there's something cultural going on, it will clue you in on it. So really helpful. Next, be aware of possible Old Testament allusions. Most parables are easily understood without a deep understanding of the Old Testament, but I do want you to know there sometimes are Old Testament allusions in them. The Old Testament talks about God being a shepherd and people being a sheep, and there is a parable about a shepherd and sheep, okay? So some understanding the Old Testament is helpful, but it's not necessary. A few other things, be aware of what's called the rule of the end. that more often than not, the last element in a parable is the most important, that usually the ending carries a lot of weight in the plot, and it carries a lot of weight in what's going on with the parable. And then be on the lookout for hyperbole and exaggeration. Many times, we're going to see this next week, many times in a parable, there is a detail that if you were in the culture, it was outlandish and it shocked them. And it would immediately have caught their attention, and a lot of times those details that shock people are the things that help convey the meaning. So again, knowing the culture, that book is really helpful for that. So those are the main pieces of advice that I can give you on understanding a parable. I think the other thing I would say is in anything, once I've come to a conclusion, check your conclusion out with a good Bible commentary or two to make sure you're not like doing something weird like St. Augustine, okay? One more thing about parables that's really important is seek out the personal challenge. You know, after doing the work of figuring out what's this mean to them, I really need to ask the question, what is God wanting for me from this parable? Because he intended these to have enduring value. They just weren't for first century people in that culture. They were not just meant for them, but they're meant for us. So I have to ask, like, where do I fit in this parable? Which character am I most like? And so I need to be asking, what's Jesus saying to me in this parable? What's the challenge that he has for me? What's he asking of me? How do I need to apply this to my life? Remember, parables are meant to elicit a response. They are a call to a decision. And if I just stop at study and I don't let it call me to a decision, then I've kind of failed at it. James talks about the Word of God is meant to be a mirror that I look into and I can see my life clearly. And that's what the parables are meant. They're meant to be mirrors, that I can see something about myself. And so James 1:22 says, do not merely listen to the Word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. So they're intended to draw me in, teach me new spiritual truth, but they're intended to elicit a response from me. Okay. Now, why communicate in this way? Why did Jesus communicate in this way? Why did he use this as one of his primary teaching methods? And I've given you some reasons, but I want to point out to me the two most important. Number one, that parables are subversive. They're subversive. I've already said parables are safe and non-threatening. That people will open themselves up to a parable because a parable comes at you indirectly, right? It doesn't come at you in a frontal assault kind of thing. Lectures, sermons tend to come at you directly. And so because it's coming indirectly, people will let their guard down. Whenever they're hearing a story, a parable, they come in the back door, so to speak. They come in with their truth in a stealthy way. We could say that parables function almost like a Trojan horse, right? Where they brought the horse in, they thought it was a gift, they didn't understand there was something packed inside that would have a great impact on them. That's really what the parables, that's how they function. And Jesus did a lot of direct teaching, but if everything was direct, constantly challenging people's long-held assumptions about what God was like, many people, even more, would have resisted him. So he used parables quite a lot, parables of all things, because that was one of his main ways to plant new ways of thinking in their minds and to teach them unconventional things about what God is like. His intent is that it would come in, the meaning would kind of explode inside, and then people would think like, that's interesting. What if that were true? Or can it possibly be? Could that be true? That's the intent of them. And so with each and every parable, what Jesus is doing, and I love this, is he's putting a pebble in the shoes of his listeners. Just something small, something that makes you a little uncomfortable, that you carry with you and for you to think about. By the way, I want to give you a challenge. I think we ought to be doing a lot more of this with people who don't know Jesus. We live in a culture where everything's a direct frontal assault. Is that right? Everything's in your face. And I have taken the example of Jesus when I'm dealing with people who are curious or they're not even sure if they're curious yet, using stories, asking a lot of questions, trying to come in the back door. Not in a bad way, but come in a back door because people are much more open and receptive to that. So I think we have a lot to learn from Jesus. There's one more thing about parables I love, and that is this. Parables are separating. They're separating. So in Matthew 13:10, his followers asked Jesus this question, why do you speak to people in parables? And I want to show you Mark's gospel, Jesus answered to that question. Okay, so here's how Jesus answered, according to the Mark's gospel. When he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. He told them, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. And the first time I read that, I was shocked. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? The reason you tell parables is because you just don't want a lot of people to know the truth and to be forgiven of their sins. I mean, haven't we been told that God cares about everybody? That he wants all people forgiven? But the reason he says he's doing these parables is he wants to keep it hidden from most people, right? That's what I thought the first time. And I want to tell you an important principle here, because each gospel writer emphasized different things about Jesus' life and his teachings, and not every gospel writer includes everything. So anytime I encounter in the gospel something that really grabs me, shocks me, I'm like, what is that about? What I will do is I will find where the other places in the gospels this occur. I'll lay them side by side because I want a fuller picture of what Jesus was really saying or doing. And so I want to do that with this. So we're back to Matthew 13, where you've been keeping your finger for a long time. Back to Matthew 13, I want to read verses 10 to 17. So why did Jesus use parables? And one, they're subversive, but two, they're separating. So let's look at Matthew 13, 10 to 17. Here's how Matthew recorded that conversation. The disciples came to him and they asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, and I'm going to come back to that topic next week, okay? The secrets of the kingdom. The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. And though hearing, they do not hear or understand. I'm going to stop for a second. We've all been there, right? Where you're with somebody and you both see the same thing, but one of you sees a deeper reality than the other one. I mean, we've all had that experience, right? I was trying to think of an example of that, and Monsters, Inc. came to mind. How many of you have seen Monsters, Inc.? To me, one of the greatest of all the Pixars. Remember Mike Wazowski in that story, and how he and Sully made a magazine cover? And when they made the magazine cover, this is what it looked like. And Mike, who, by the way, if you don't know, is the dude that's behind the barcode. Mike, upon seeing the magazine for the first time, he says, I don't believe it. I'm on the cover of a magazine, okay? So he sees, but he doesn't really see the reality that you can't even see Mike, okay? So to me, that's kind of what Jesus is talking about. So verse 14. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You'll be ever seeing, but never perceiving. And now here's why. Verse 15, so important. For. That word is really significant. For. Okay? Back to 14. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding, ever seeing, never perceiving. For, or because, this people's heart has become calloused. That's why people can't see and people can't hear. Their heart is calloused. The NLT says, for their hearts are hardened. A famous Greek dictionary says that this word in Greek means that these people have become impervious to the truth. They're impervious to the truth. Look at the rest of 15. For they hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. They have closed their eyes. Otherwise, if they hadn't closed their eyes, and if their hearts weren't calloused, otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. Or in Mark's language, they would turn and be forgiven. But blessed are your ears because they see, and your eyes because they see, your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Here's how the NLT translates this. I think they do a really great job with it. To those who listen to my teaching, more understanding will be given, and they will have an abundance of knowledge. But for those who are not listening, even what little understanding they have will be taken away from them. That is why I use these parables. For they look, but they don't really see. They hear, but they don't really listen or understand. This fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah that says, when you hear what I say, you will not understand. When you see what I do, you will not comprehend. For the hearts of these people are hardened. Their ears cannot hear. They have closed their own eyes, so their eyes cannot see, their ears cannot hear, their hearts cannot understand. They cannot turn to me and let me heal them. So here's the point of Matthew 13, 10-17. It is not that Jesus is intentionally hiding the good news from people. That's not what's going on. It's that he's allowing the parables to have their work of separating people out. That's what he's doing. Okay, let me try to explain that. The parables are meant to generate curiosity, right? That's the intent. They draw you in. They make you ask questions about that deeper meaning. And the curious would do that. In Matthew 13, later on, we'll see that Jesus' disciples, after a parable, they say, what does that mean? Okay, so they're curious and they're wanting to know. But if somebody is uninterested and they're antagonistic, they would have no interest in delving into the parable to figure out what it means, right? They wouldn't want to do the deep work that was required to get to that deeper spiritual significance. They wouldn't give the time to do the work of mining out the treasures of that parable. What they'll do is they'll just blow him off. They'll walk away. They'll be like, what was that all about, right? What's the point of that? How silly was that story? And they won't think about it, and because they won't think about it, they won't get the deeper meaning. And let's say somebody did get the point, and there's some parables where his enemies really did get the point, the people who were against him. If you're super antagonistic to him, you're not going to care anyways, and you're going to walk away and not apply it, correct? So again, the parables serve to separate. They serve to separate the open-minded from the closed. They serve to winnow out those who are interested in him and those who are uninterested, those who are sympathetic to Jesus and curious, and those who are unsympathetic and agnostic and were against him. As Craig Blumberg says, the parables conceal and reveal because of the condition of the listener. Because of the condition of the listener. As C.S. Lewis famously said in The Magician's Nephew, what a person sees and hears depends a good deal on where they are standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. So the kind of person you are affects what you see and what you hear. And so what the parables did is they gave a person, essentially, they gave them the chance to self-select out with Jesus. Their hearts were hard. They'd select out. They become more hardened. They select out. They're not going to see deeply. They already don't. They're going to see less deeply. They're going to hear less deeply than before. I like how Eugene Peterson paraphrases this. Whenever someone has a ready heart for this, the insights and understandings will flow freely. But if there's no readiness, any trace of receptivity soon disappears. That's why I tell stories. I want to create readiness. Let me just say something really brief about this thing of separating. The parables are subversive. I think we need to get better at that, coming in people's back door. I think we need to get better at this. That we don't want to allow people to self-separate out from Jesus. Do you know that? Somebody I care about and they want to walk away from him, we struggle so much, and we'll put pressure on them. We'll do all sorts of things like keep them following him. And I see so many times that Jesus would allow people to self-select away from him. And doesn't mean I don't care and I pursue people, but I think we need to let people have the ability to do that. I've seen that so much in my own life and ministry. So why am I doing this series? Several reasons. First, I'm doing it because the parables contain some of the most profound teaching in Jesus' ministry. Look, already we're some people are self-selecting out. Look at this. I'm doing it because they contain some of the most profound and important teachings of his ministry. I think they deserve our attention. I'm also doing it because they are some of the most confusing and misunderstood of his teachings, and I want to help try to bring some clarity to that, okay? They're too valuable to leave to just wild speculation. Thirdly, I love the parables because of their subversive nature. And one of my favorite things about them that I'm going to talk a little bit about next week is they're so counterintuitive. The way people tend to think about God or his kingdom, they take a total opposite view. And the way how they subvert the way people think, how they challenge us, how they challenge our thinking, that's one of my favorite things about them. And finally, I'm doing it because it is a great way to share the good news of Jesus with somebody. I told last week, I said, I have used the parables dozens and dozens of times with people who are seeking God to help them understand the gospel, and they are so effective at that. And so part of the reason I'm doing that is so that there's some people here who are seeking Jesus who still haven't figured this out. It will be helpful to make the gospel clear, but there's some people who do not come here, and like last week, I really want to challenge you. We have these postcards. I want to challenge you to take one of these on the way out. They're on the back table. I want you to pray about one person that you can invite, and I'd like to challenge you to invite them. And because there's a lot of research in our culture. A lot of people don't like the church, but almost everybody likes Jesus. So you say, hey, come hear about Jesus, and come hear the stories he told. There are these unconventional stories for an unconventionally good news. Don't we all need good news these days? And just give somebody an invite. And I know that's fearful, but I just want to challenge you to do it. Take the courage, step in and do it. My dad used to always tell me, all a person can say is no, right? And I think we can all survive a no. And so he told me, don't be afraid to ask. So I tried to use that in my life. When Pat and I got engaged, the night we got engaged, it was a big deal. Went back to the dorm room, told the guys. They kind of knew it was coming, but they were all excited that I pulled it off, one. And two, that Pat said yes. And they're like, man, we should do pizza. And I think one of the guys like, I wonder if anybody would ever give people free pizza. And I'm like, you know what? It never hurts to ask. So I got on the phone. I called Domino's right next to our college. And I asked the guy that answered, I said, hey, I just got engaged. Do you guys do free pizza for people that get engaged? And he goes, I have never been asked that. I don't know. Let me get my manager. So the manager got on, and I said, hey, I just got engaged. Would you do free pizza for somebody that got engaged? He said, I've never been asked that in my life, but you know what? I'm going to do it for you. He sent like 15 pizzas over to our dorm floor, and we got to eat tons and tons of free pizza, okay? It was so awesome. Now, you guys are smiling. I just want you to know Pat didn't smile. The next morning when I told her that, she's like, how come you didn't bring any of that over to our dorm floor, right? So we could celebrate. But, we're guys. It's pizza. But all that is take the courage, step out, invite somebody. Just give it to them and say, we're doing this. I think it's a great way to understand who Jesus is. So do that. Leland Ryken calls the parables masterpieces of storytelling. I cannot wait to get into them. So I just want to finish. I want to take this and I want to turn it back on all of us, okay? And we talked about what do they like and why would Jesus use stories and how do you interpret them and understand them? But here's what I want to turn us to. I want to turn us to Matthew 13 and his emphasis on the human heart. Because the reason he told them is because of the heart. And so my question for all of us today is this. I want to know, how's your heart? As we sit here today, new school year starting, craziness, how's your heart? How is your soul? Really? How is your soul where you sit today? Is it open to God? Is it receptive? Are you're living like you're really longing to know him and hear from him? Are you living responsive to him? We don't always understand why he commands things, but am I living obediently, or is there a part of my life I'm purposely not being obedient? I'm not being responsive? Is your heart a little bit hard right now? Would you say, where I find myself today, my heart's a little bit calloused, kind of closed off for God? Those are pretty strong words, right? But perhaps what you'd say is, I'm feeling spiritually numb right now. God's kind of distant to me. My heart's not in a good place. And so what I want to do is I just want you to invite you just for a minute, talk to God about that, wherever your heart is. If it's in a great place, that's great. Praise him for that. But if you would say, you know what, my heart's not in a great place, I'd like you to pray and talk to him about that. So you can just take a minute and do that. You know, as we enter this series, because he's going to challenge us, we need surrendered hearts. And that's why we introduced this song this morning, because it speaks so much to that. It goes so well with the parables. So I'd like to invite you to stand if you're able. And can we, as we enter in this, can we just take a moment and just sing this from the heart and say, Lord, we've talked about where our heart is. Can we just surrender ourselves anew to him? So would you join us in worship?
Here is where I lay it down, every burden, every crown. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. Here is where I lay it down, every lie and every doubt. This is my surrender. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. Oh, and I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. Here is where I lay it down, every burden, every crown. This is my surrender. This is my surrender. Here is where I lay it down, every lie and every doubt. This is my surrender. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. Oh, and I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. Shake up the ground of all my tradition, break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Oh, your way is better. Shake up the ground of all my tradition, break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Oh, your way is better. Shake up the ground of all my tradition, break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Oh, your way is better. I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. Oh, and I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. Oh, and I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to. Here is where I lay it down. You are all I'm chasing now. This This is my surrender.
If you're concerned about the state of your heart and your soul right now, grab somebody who you're close to, grab them and say, can you pray with me? I just need some prayer. I'd be happy to do that. I prayed with a number of people first service, so I'll be up here if you just want somebody to pray over you. I'd love to do that. So, can I say a prayer for us? Father, thank you for these parables, these amazing stories that we're going to delve into. Thank you for the creative way that you use them to sneak into people's hearts, to sneak into my heart, and to plant truths that are so important, counter-cultural things that we don't expect. I pray that we would be open to the truth of the parables. We know a lot of them, but I pray we'd be open anew for what you'll speak through them. And Lord, I just pray for all of us in our hearts. Some of us are struggling. We're feeling dry or dead, or I just pray that we'd seek out people we love to be held up in prayer and have somebody to walk through with that. So I pray in your name, Jesus. Amen. All right, 12, grab a card on your way out, invite somebody, and you are sent.